All right, Rabbi say good morning. Let us begin. Let's begin by thanking our sponsors of this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Avraham Shaindy Kelman, for dedicating all the shiurim and drushos this month in memory of their parents. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Hilary, Jacobson-Kent, and Yisrael, Doniel, Jacobson, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Milton, Jacobson, Mordechai, Menashe ben Shirmeyahu, as well as Paul and Kathy Pollack as zechus for refuah shlaimah for Alter ben Golda Etcha. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, the Plunka family, in commemoration of the yahrzeits of Shaul, Hamelech, incredible, and Gershon, Chaim, Alter ben Shaul, George Rosenberg, Mrs. Plunka's father on the 28th of Elul. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families a nechama. But also with that, let us begin. We have an incredibly exciting daf ahead of us today. I'm sorry, we're without a microphone, so I'm sorry. I'm going to try my best to project, but let's begin. So today's daf is daf Hey, daf 5. We are picking up on Daled Amud Beis, 3 lines up from the bottom, and an incredible sugya today. The sugya actually of Rosh Hashana. It's mamish absolutely incredible that we're arming ourselves with this knowledge and with this sugya in advance of the Yom Tov. So says the Gemara Itmar, Shnei Yamim Tovim Shal Rosh Hashana, the 2 days of Rosh Hashana. So we'll say, what's the status of the days? Remember again, we're focusing on all of these issues through the prism of the egg. So the Gemara says, Rav Shmuel Dermit Havai Nol de Bezu Asura Bezu. So Rav and Shmuel both said the halacha lamaisa. If the chicken lays the egg on the first day of Yom Tiv, it is going to remain asur on the second day of Yom Tiv. That ultimately Nol de Bezu Asura Bezu. Now what's the logic? Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. 3 lines up from the bottom in Rashi. Asura Bezu Shem Vadai Chok Kavua Lios Kiyom Aruch. Midrabanon, Shemitchila lo machma safek yischil lasos. And we'll say, remember again, we've already made reference to this, that the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah will be different than the 2 days of a regular Yom Tov, what we'll call Yom Tov Sheni Shal Galios, because Yom Tov of Rosh Hashanah from the beginning was instituted as what? What we call a Yoma Arichta, 1 long period of Kiddusha. So remember again, when we were speaking about other Yomim Tovim, 2 day Yomim Tovim, diaspora Yomim Tovim, and we spoke about that the chicken lays the egg on the first day, it's mutter on the second day, what was the logic behind that? Because we know what? One of those days is what? Is Chol. Right? Because remember again, I'm keeping 2 days out of Safek, but Lamaisa, I know there's only 1 day of Yom Tiv, so one of them is Kodesh, one of them is Chol. The Gemara is suggesting over here that Rosh Hashanah is different. Both days were instituted as 1 long period of Kiddusha. This nan, but say, here is the story of Rosh Hashanah. Here is the evolution of the Yom Tov of Rosh Hashanah. This nan, Bereshama hayim mekablin edus hachodesh kolayam kulo. Bereshama means in the beginning. In the beginning, they used to accept testimony from witnesses the entire day. So understand, how does Rosh Hashanah work? So look at Rashi. This Rashi is really incredible. Rashi says, Kol hayom, that's Rashi in the Daf. Kol shloshim shel Elul. So all the 30th day of Elul. So remember again, a day could either have 29 days or 30 days, right? So remember again, 30 days or 31 days. No, 29 days or 30 days. So listen to this. On the 30th day, remember again, so the 30th day was the first possible day for Rosh Chodesh. Beis Din was prepared to be Makabal the Eidim, right? Remember, you can't be Makadish the Chodesh. You cannot sanctify the new month without the arrival of witnesses. So remember, here's the interesting part. So the 30th day begins when? At night, right? The earliest time you're expecting Eidim is when? The next morning, right? Because remember again, they have to see the moon. You're going to see the moon at night. So remember again, Eidim aren't getting, and Beis Din doesn't sit in session at night anyway. So Rashi explains the following. Comes the night of the 30th, Yom Shloshim She'alu Umi Ba'erev Hayosrim Malacha. Something very interesting had to happen. Already, the 30th at night, they had to stop doing Malacha. Why? Right? Because the witnesses may come the day of the 30th. So look how interesting this is. They had to begin to observe Yom Tiv even before witnesses came. This was a unique aspect over here because there's the possibility. So just imagine for a moment that the night of the 30th begins Monday night. Right? Let's say for argument's sake, the night of the 30th begins, or I should say the 30th day is Tuesday. 30th day is Tuesday. Monday night already, they had to begin an Isra Malacha. they had to stop all malacha because of the possibility, because there's the possibility that maybe witnesses will show up on Tuesday. Now remember, if witnesses show up on Tuesday and they say Monday night we saw the new moon, that effectively means that what? Day number 30, Monday night, Tuesday is Yom Tiv. So because that possibility, they already had to abstain from malacha Monday night. Because the entire 30th day, in our example, Tuesday, they would be waiting for the people who saw the moon. So both say, so again, this is how Rosh Hashanah used to work, right? So they would go ahead already the night of the 30th, they would not do any malacha in anticipation that maybe the witnesses will show up the day of the 30th. Okay, fine. What happened? Something amazing. Pamachos nishtau ha'idim lavo. One time, the witnesses were delayed in arriving. We'll define what that means in just a moment. Top of hay. V'niskalkalu haLeviim b'shir. And as a result, the Leviim messed up the shir shel yom. Now, what happened? We're take a look at the top Rashi and Aleph. Niskalkalu Leviim b'shir. So we'll say, Nishtoa Eidim means the Eidim arrived later. Now we're going to see what later means is after they offered up the carbon tamid shal bein ha'arbayim, the afternoon tamid. Rashi says over here, as a result, niskalku alavim b'shir, Rashi says, tamid shal bein ha'arbayim, sha'amru bo shira shal chol, shahayu svurim shalo yavu od, vayom chol, ukishabo, nimtza shu kodesh, ubishal shachar ein tos, the tamid shal shachar, so listen to this. So what happened? This is incredible. So, remember, they're waiting the whole 30th day. That night already, they stopped doing malacha. They're waiting for the witnesses to come. It's time to offer up the carbon tamid shal bein ha'arbayim, the afternoon tamid. The witnesses didn't come yet. So they assumed, right, the Sanhedrin assumed the witnesses aren't coming. They assume they're not coming, which means tomorrow will be Rosh Hashanah. So they instructed the Levim to say the shir shal yom of a regular weekday. What happened? After the Levim said the shir shal of a regular weekday, offered up tamid shal bein ha'arbayim, the witnesses came. So it turns out that what? That day really was Kodesh, and the Leviim said the wrong Shira. They said the wrong Shira. Now remember, sacrificially nothing was doing it. It's the same carbon. Remember, you offer up the Tamid Shal Bein Ha'arbayim or every day. It's the same Tamid, but they sang the wrong Shira. Now, we'll say, Rashi just points out over here, by the way, what did they do for the Tamid Shal Shachar Sheben Ha'arbayim? What did they do for the morning Tamid? Right? Which Shira did they sing? Well, there, you really have no choice but to sing the regular weekday Shira, because generally the Eidim never came that early. They were never there before the Tamid Shal Shachar was offered up. So it was standard operating procedure that you would sing the Shir Shal Yom of the regular day for the Tamid Shal Shachar, but usually the witnesses came before the Tamid Shal Bein Ha'arbayim. So the Gemara says, so listen to this. Hiskinu, therefore they instituted, Shlo yu mekablen es ha'edin ela min ha'mincha. So they made a takana. The takana was that we only accept witnesses up until mincha time, which means the time for Tamid Shal Bein Ha'arbayim. So if witnesses come after that time, essentially what you automatically do is what? Delay Rosh Hashanah or delay the observance until the next day. We'll define this in a moment. And if the Eidim come after mincha time, so noagin osayom kodesh ulamachar kodesh, they would go and they would observe 2 days. 2 days. So now watch what happened over here. Originally, Rosh Hashanah was 1 day. When we say originally, the Torah mandates Rosh Hashanah is 1 day. And again, but what they would do is already come day number 30, they would observe that day in a state of Kedusha in anticipation of the arrival of the witnesses. Usually the witnesses would come sometime during the day, and they would establish it as Rosh Hashanah. Now remember, even in that model, for some reason the Eidim did not come until day 31, right? Day 31 would be Rosh Hashanah, and day 30 would still been ex post facto observed in a state of Kedusha. One time it happened that Allah Chalamaysa, the witnesses came after Tamid Shal Bein Ha'arbayim. Leviah made a mistake. Again, they couldn't have forecasted any differently, and they went ahead and they said the Shir Shal Yom Shal Chol, even though it turns out that it was really Yom Tiv. At that point in time, new piece of legislation, we only accept Eidos until Tamid Shal Bein Ha'arbayim, which means that if witnesses show up after Tamid Shal Bein Ha'arbayim, what do? We automatically defer their testimony to the next day. Which means something very interesting. Which means even though we know that today was Rosh Hashanah, we defer we close it out. You can't declare Rosh Hashanah without the testimony of the witnesses. We defer them to next day. So which means right from the beginning, even Bisman HaMikdash, there were 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. But it's not a classic 2-day Yom Tiv. Because think about this just a moment. When we think about a 2-day Yom Tiv, we think about Yom Tiv Sheni Shal Galios, diaspora Yom Tiv. Diaspora Yom Tiv centers around what? Calendrical doubt. Safek. Were there 2 days of Rosh Hashanah observed in the Beis HaMikdash? Yes. Was there ever an element of doubt? Never. In other words, there might have been a little bit of doubt in the beginning of day number 30. Is it going to be today? Is it going to be tomorrow? But at the end of the day, quite literally, they understood which day was Rosh Hashanah, which day wasn't. They had to keep 2 days because, again, remember, everything relies on the arrival of the witnesses. We have to cap when we take testimony because you don't want to mess up the afternoon tamid. So they would observe 2 days, but it wasn't out of doubt. And because it wasn't out of doubt, therefore the 2 days essentially take on the halachic status of what? One long day. What we call the Yoma Arichta, one long period of Kiddusha. Let's say, I just find this something very interesting, and then we'll look back at Rashi. Let's look at Rashi first. Rashi says, Ada Mincha. This is a very important Rashi. Ada Kravis Tamish Labin Arbaim. Avala Acher Mikan. So remember again, then they instituted, will only accept testimony from the witnesses up until, I'm calling it Mincha time, but you understand that it means up until the time of the Tamid Shalbein HaArbaim. But after that time, so we'll say what that would mean is, by the way, interesting, even though the witnesses show up on we'll call it day number 30, halacha l'maisa, we declare Rosh Hashanah the next day, which means you'll count for Yom Kippur, for Sukkot, from the next day. Elagomrin oso biisura kasher husru adam mincha mimalacha kachno again begomrin oso bikdusha surabos. And here's what's interesting. One more piece. So let's play this out. The witnesses, right? It's day number 30. From already the night before, we've been observing it as Yom Tiv, lest the witnesses show up. We're about to offer up Tamid Shalbein Arbaim. The witnesses are not there, right? We offer up Tamid Shalbein Arbaim. The witnesses come after the Tamid. When do we accept their testimony? As of, right? Tomorrow, the next day. So you might have thought, okay, well, that should mean then what? The rest of the day is not Yom Tiv. You can't do that, right? Why can't we do that? Because there's a fundamental concern. If you go ahead and make the rest of the day chol, then what's going to happen? Next year on day number 30, people will come to be mezalzel. They'll come to denigrate the sanctity of the day. So we have this fascinating halachic catch-22. So even though, again, when the witnesses show up after mincha time, I know that today's not Rosh Hashanah. It's not Rosh Hashanah today. Rosh Hashanah is tomorrow. But yet we have to observe the rest of the day, B'Kedusha, so that for next year, if the witnesses do come on day number 30, no one denigrates the sanctity of that day. Finish Rashi. Alma. Both say here, this is the most important, this is an incredibly important part of Rashi. Alma, Tchilas Asiya Shnei Yomim, the Rosh Hashanah Afilu Bebeis Din Haba. Therefore, you see from the beginning, they were observing 2 days of Rosh Hashanah even in the Beis HaMikdash. Below me safek, and the observance was not out of doubt. Shari vadai sheyom tov lemachar, because I will say they knew very quickly which day was Rosh Hashanah, which wasn't. V'afal pikein tiknu la'asoso. Shmamina chok chachamim umitzvasan haya la'asosim bebo edim achar mincha. So I will say, so therefore again, this is what's unique about Rosh Hashanah. It's 2 days because we have this edus issue, but it's not 2 days out of doubt. It was 2 days that were legislated as a Yoma Arichta. Now here's what's interesting. Barachokim yeshem la'asosim b'chol shana. So we'll say, here's what's fascinating. You see, in the beginning, think about this for just a moment. In the beginning, right? When witnesses showed up, let's say witnesses showed up on day number 30 and said, we saw the moon last night. When is Rosh Hashanah? That day. What about the next day? No. In the original version, it happened often that there were 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. And when there were 2 days, it's Yom Arichta, but it didn't have to be 2 days. If witnesses showed up early enough on day number 30, Rosh Hashanah would be the first day and not the second day. Rashi points out something very interesting over here. But remember, in diaspora communities, Rosh Hashanah was always what? was always 2 days. Was always 2 days. And in diaspora communities, why did you observe 2 days? V'arechokim yeshen la'asosim b'chol shana, shema yavo'u edim achara mincha, v'arikdushaso achaz, ve'en kan lomar manavsha, chad minei uchol, the shema ein kan chol l'shtem kodesh. So I'll say, interestingly enough, in the diaspora communities, they always had to keep 2 days. But even in diaspora communities, the element of keeping 2 days still was, meaning, because in the Beis Hamikdash they were sometimes keeping 2 days, Rosh Hashanah takes on this Yoma Arichta identity even in the diaspora. So I will say what comes out is something really fascinating. When the Beis Hamikdash stood before the Takana, it's possible again to have Rosh Hashanah for 1 day. Right, for 1 day. Sometimes you had 2 days when the witnesses came a little bit later in the day. It seems to be that once they made the takana, that you only accept edus until Tamid Shal Bein Arbayim, it sounds like more often than not, Rosh Hashanah was 2 days. Because just the timing of witnesses coming. So it turns out that Rosh Hashanah was 2 days, but not legislated misafik, legislated because of an edus technicality, and therefore again, to illustrate that it's not a suffix, Chazal, the framework of the 2 day Rosh Hashanah is Yoma Arichta, 1 long day. You'll say to yourself, who cares if it's 1 long day or 2 kedushas? Oh, so first of all, we'll see a number of nafkaminas, but amongst them, an egg. An egg. On a typical Yom Tov Sheni Shal Golios, we have an opinion that says, Nolda Bazu Mutares Bazu. If it's born on the first day, it's mutter on the second day, because you want Shach. If the first day is Yom Tov, then the second day is Chol. And if the second day is Yom Tov, the first day was Chol. So on by the time you get to the second day Yom Tov, the egg is mutter. On Rosh Hashanah, because it's Yom Arichta, 1 long day, if the egg is born on day number 1, it will still remain Asr on day number 2. Because it is 1 sustained period of Kiddush. I'll just say something very interesting. It's worth it to note that from a hashkafic perspective, if you notice the story, when does everything change? Nishtahu ha'idim lavo. Right, the witnesses were delayed in arriving. They were late. Now, by the way, that doesn't mean that it's the fault of the witnesses, right? It doesn't mean, again, but you see, bad things happen when you're not timely, right? Which is a good yesod in life in general. Timeliness is a function of being a masudar person. And when you are a masudar person, a person who lives with a sense of seder, a sense of order in life, you accomplish more. If you're always late, right? If you're chronically late, or even just episodically late, that's a lack of seder. And when there's a lack of seder, other things fall apart. Because my timeliness or lack thereof impact other things as well. So the Edom were late. It's okay, what's the big deal? A couple of minutes late. Yeah, except there's a whole Beis Hamikdash that's waiting for you to arrive. So there's an incredible Musar Haskell just in Seder, but I think there's also something fascinating, which is sometimes Nishta Lavo just means tarry. You know, sometimes when opportunities present themselves and you tarry, you miss the opportunities. Right? The Edom, Nishtahu Lavo could be for a variety of different reasons. But when you're not alacritous, right, when you don't have zrizos, and you don't take advantage, and you don't seize the opportunities of life as they present themselves, they simply go away. When you have an opportunity to Mekadesh the Chodesh, you have an opportunity to Mekadesh yourself, you have the opportunity to bring a Rosh Hashanah, a new beginning, and you're nishtah lavo, you're late to the party, you delay, you tarry, you often miss that opportunity, the window often closes. The din of zrizos in our opportunities of life. When opportunity comes, be zoriz and ultimately take. It says the Gemara, Amar Rabba, Mitakanas Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai ve'elech, Beitzah muteres. Let's listen to this. Now Rabba comes along and says, but Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai made a takana. And what's his takana? Well, we'll see what it is in just a moment. From his takana and on, the egg is mutter on Yom Tiv. Now, what happened to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? Well, here we go. Disnan. Mishachara Beis Hamikdash. Once the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, so remember again, even once the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the Sanhedrin still functioned. Right? The Sanhedrin was in Yavne. Right? So the Sanhedrin still functioned, which means that they were still declaring the new month based on Eidos. Now, once the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed, what, unfortunately, do you no longer have to worry about? The Talmud Shal Bein Arbayim. So there's no problem with the Shira, mixing up the Shira. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, now that there's no Beis Hamikdash, we could accept testimony when? The entire day. The entire day 30. Mishachara Beis Hamikdash Hiskam Yochanan ben Zakkai Shemekablen Eidos HaChodesh Kol Hayom. Basically, this was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says you can accept testimony the entire day. The entire day. I will say, take a look at Rashi. Rashi is Mitachas Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai Shehichzir Hadavar Liyoshno. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai essentially reinstituted the original practice. The Kabbalah Dusan Kolim to accept testimony the entire day. Ulakadesh Hayom Nimsa Shein Bezdin Osin Shnei Yamim Varechokim Osin Shnei Yamim Eno Ela Misafek Shein Yodin Im Niskadesh B'Yom Shloshim Im V'Shloshim V'Echad V'Hari Hein Keshar Yom Tov Shal Golios Ubeitzah Shenol Debazeh Muteres Bazeh Mimanav Shach Techam Minayachos. So Rabbi say, here's what's interesting. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai Beis Hamikdash is destroyed and goes out and reinstitutes the former practice, namely, accept Eidos the entire day. So what ends up happening, by the way, is that more often than not, Rosh Hashanah is just one day. It's just one day, because usually, right? Because usually Rosh Hashanah was day number 30. So more often than not, they would go ahead and have one day Rosh Hashanah. Now again, even when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai came along, could it be that Rosh Hashanah is 2 days? Could it be? It could. When would that happen? If the Eidim show up night 31 or day 31, right? So then ultimately, again, that absolutely could occur. But Lamaisa, more often than not, it was one day. Now in Chutz La'aretz, they would observe Rosh Hashanah for 2 days. Else what? Sveka Diyoma. They just weren't sure. So now, interesting enough, Rabbi says, from when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai reinstituted the original practice, interestingly enough, an egg becomes permitted on second day Rosh Hashanah, because now you can't. It's not Yoma Arichta anymore. At most, it's going to be back to what we call Sveka Diyoma. Abaye, Rabbi Beitzah Asura. Avraham and Shmuel both held that the egg is asur both days of Rosh Hashanah. So Amrlei, he said to him, Amina lecha an Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, va'at amrit li Rav Shmuel. I'm talking about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Why are you bringing up Rav and Shmuel? Well, Rav Shmuel kashya masnisin, and Rav Shmuel, what do they do with the Mishnah? Lo kashya halon v'halahu. We'll say to which Rashi explains we're talking about the Jews of Bavel versus the Jews of Eretz Yisrael. How so? Take a look at Rashi. Halon v'halahu libnei Eretz Yisrael sha'osin yom echad muteres. So we'll say for the Jews of Eretz Yisrael who only observe one day, ultimately again the Beitzah will be mutter on the second day. Aval l'didan b'nei gola asura sha'adayin anu osin shnei yamim va'odena kibatchila mipnei osa takana rishona lo mipnei savek. So we'll say, this is where it begins to get a little bit confusing, because now what the Gemara is suggesting is, listen to this. In Eretz Yisrael, they originally had one day, and sometimes kept the second day out of Safek. Then after the Takana, they kept 2 days. 2 days was Yom HaRichta. Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, so ultimately Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, let's go back to what we originally did and accept Eidos the entire day. In Chutz La'aretz, so now what were they doing in Chutz La'aretz? They were still keeping 2 days. The Gemara suggests that according to Rav and Shmuel, they were keeping 2 days in Chutz La'aretz, but not as Sveka Diyoma, but rather as what? Yom HaRichta. They continued their 2-day process, or their 2-day Yom Tiv, in accordance with the 2-day Yom Tiv framework, as was observed in the Beis HaMikdash after the Takana. So we're going to see, this is going to go back and forth a little bit with how we understand what was happening in Chutz La'aretz. Rabbi Yosef says no. Af mitakanas, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai ve'elech. So Rabbi Yosef says not true. Even after Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai made his Takana, namely to what? To accept Eidos after Tamid Shal Bein Arbayim, or I should say after Mincha time, the Gemara says, nevertheless, Beitzah Asura, the egg will continue to be Asur. My time, what's the reason for that? Have a Davar Sheva Minyan. Ultimately, again, because it's a Davar Sheva Minyan, the Chol Davar Sheva Minyan Tzarech Minyan Achar Lahatiro. Both say there is another issue. There's another. Moshe David, can you do me a favor? Just close that, just pull that wall so the side room's closed, because the 9 o'clock meeting is going to do slichas in that side room. Thank you. So the Chaldavar Sheh Minyan Tzarech Minyan Achal Atiro. Both say there is another reason. There's another reason ultimately again why halacha lemaisa you need. I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. There is even from the Takana of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the egg still becomes aser. Why does the egg remain aser? Because ultimately, again, the legislation concerning the egg is something we call a davar sheba minyan. What's it? Davar sheba minyan means any piece of legislation which was legislated by a robust rabbinic body requires a rabbinic body of similar number and size, right? Or I should say number and wisdom in order to repeal that legislation. So the Gemara says, so therefore again, since it was legislated, ultimately, again, that Rosh Hashanah is a Yom HaArichta, and therefore, Nolda Bazu Asura Bazu, that remains, even once Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai makes his takana to accept legislation min ha-mincha ulamayla. So the Gemara says, by the way, both say this principle in halacha drives so much of what we know today. For example, there are so many takanas that Chazal made that, for specific reasons. And yet what? Halacha l'maisa, the reason may not be there. But yet the halacha still remains. Why is that? It's just part of the way our legal system is set up. When Chazal make a halacha, now again, there's a difference between takana and gezer, which we're not going to get into. When Chazal make a halacha, that halacha remains on the books until you could have a similar rabbinic body that is empowered to repeal it. We have many examples. I'll give you a simple example. Right? There's a prohibition to take medicine on Shabbos. You're not going to take medicine on Shabbos. Why can't you? Again, I'm speaking in generalities. There are times that you can, but in general, why can't you take medicine on Shabbos? Why not? Why not? Because grinding. Schikas samimonim. Come on, one second. Who's grinding? Who's grinding their medicine today? You're right. Maybe the reason for the gzera doesn't apply, but the gzera still remains. So you have many different examples of this. So that's called a davar sheba minyan. Anything that was legislated as part of a rabbinic body, ultimately, again, sarich minyan achar lahatiro, requires another rabbinic body of similar number in order to go ahead and repeal the legislation. Says the Gemara, from where do we know this? This is interesting. From where do we know this? This is fascinating. The Gemara says, where do I know this from? Now, what the Gemara is going to do is quote three different proofs which are not going to make so much sense when we first read them. Now we'll explain them on the base. The pasuk says by Mamed Har Sinai, after Kabbalah Satorah, Hashem says to Moshe, tell the men to go return to their tents. Tell the people to return to their tents. Va'omer, b'mshoch hayovel, hema yalu bahar. Pasuk says when they blow the shofar, they could go back up the mountain. Also reference to Har Sinai. We'll define what those means in just a moment. V'tanya, listen to this. Kerem Revai. We'll say, what's Kerem Revai? We know there's halacha of Arla. Right? Arla says that halacha l'maisa, fruit for the first 3 years, you're not allowed to eat it. Kerem Revai is a special din by a vineyard, by grapes, that says that in year number 4, you're allowed to eat it, but what? You must eat it in Yerushalayim like Meiser Sheni. So eat it in Yerushalayim like Meiser Sheni. Listen to this, Rabbi. This is incredible. So that is a din d'oraisa. That is din d'oraisa. So Kerem Revai, Haya'ola liyushalayim Hamelech yomecha l'chol tzad. So Rabbi said the halacha was, now that's a d'oraisa. What the rabbis legislated was that halacha l'maisa, if you live within 1 day's journey of, now, okay, let me say one more thing. Kerem Revai like Meiser Sheni. Let's say you don't want to bring up your clusters of grapes to Yerushalayim. So what can you do? You could redeem the grapes onto money, bring the money to Yerushalayim, spend the money there. Same like Meiser Sheni. Chazal, the rabbis instituted that if you lived within a 1 day journey of Yerushalayim, you cannot go ahead and redeem your produce. You must bring the produce itself. So the Gemara says, this was the boundary. Alas minat Safon was the city of Alas from the north. Akravas minat Daram. Lud minat Mairav. V'yarde minat Mizrach. So these were the boundary cities. These were all cities that were within 1 day journey. So if you lived from these cities and close to Yerushalayim, you could not redeem your Kerem Revai. You had to bring the actual fruit to Yerushalayim. Matam. Why did the rabbis legislate this? In order to go ahead and literally decorate the marketplaces of Yerushalayim with fruit. In other words, that the rabbis wanted the marketplaces of Yerushalayim to be teeming with fruit. So in order to do that, they commanded that if you live within a 1 day journey to Yerushalayim, you need to bring your Kerem Revai to Yerushalayim. Okay. Betanya, we learned Kerem Revai hayalol Rabbi Eliezer b'Mizrach. Rabbi Eliezer had Kerem Revai, right? So he had he had, excuse me, b'mizrach Lod. So Rabbi Eliezer lived within 1 day journey of Yerushalayim. Within 1 day journey of Yerushalayim. So what happened? So he went ahead and he had Kerem Revai. So b'mizrach Lod b'tzar Kfar Tavi. So he was in the north by Lod, by next to the village of Tavi. Amud Beis ubikesh lahafkiro la'aniyim. And he decided, you know what? It's too much effort for me to go ahead and bring all of my grapes to Yerushalayim. So he was just going to make it all hefker. Because remember, he assumed that he did not have a redemption option, right? Why not? Because at the end of the day, he was within a 1 day journey to Yerushalayim. So he assumed that he had to bring his Kerem Revai with him to Yerushalayim. So he decided, you know what? It's too much effort. I'm just going to make everything hefker. Amrul Talmid of his student said to him, Rabbi, Kvar nimnu alecha chaverecha. Right? Your friends have already taken care of you. Vihiti ruha, and have already permitted it. Meaning, Rabbi, you don't have to schlep your Kerem Revai up to Yerushalayim. Rather, if you want to go ahead and redeem it, you could redeem it. Now, what happened over here? Look at Rashi. Kvar nimnu alecha chaverecha vihiti ruha. Liftoso ulalosa damav. So we're going to see what happened. This legislation was put into effect when? When the Beis HaMikdash stood. Because it was considered to be a covet to the Beis HaMikdash for the marketplaces of Yerushalayim to be teeming with fruit, especially when people would be Ola Regel. So what happened? By the time this is happening over here, when this particular episode is happening over with Rabbi Eliezer, the Beis HaMikdash was already destroyed. Was already destroyed. So Eliezer doesn't want to schlep up the fruit. He's about to make it hefker. And his Talmidim say, Rabbi, no, you don't have to make it hefker. Your friends have already repealed the enactment. They repealed the enactment. You don't have to schlep up the fruit. You can redeem it from an Nebos. Now here's what's interesting. Man Chaverecha, who are his friends? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his Beis Din repealed the earlier legislation. Nebos, now what do you see from here? You see something quite fascinating, which is what? That, remember, they made an enactment for what purpose? For what purpose? To go ahead and make Yerushalayim beautiful in the presence of the Beis HaMikdash. Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. You would have assumed that, therefore, what would happen? The enactment would kind of fall off on its own. But you see, that's not what occurred. And in fact, it is only repealed when what? When Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his Beis Din actively repeal it. Daima denimnu. The reason why the enactment regarding Kerem Revai was repealed was because Halacha L'Mais Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his Beis Din actively repealed it. Halom nimnu lo. But ultimately, what do you see from here? That had they not stepped in and repealed the legislation, it would have stood on the books, even though what? Even though the reason for the enactment was no longer valid. I will say this is a major principle in halacha called davar shebeminyan tzarich minyan achar lahatiro. Whenever something is legislated in halacha, is there a repeal process? Absolutely. Not for daraisis, but there's a repeal process for derabanans. But the repeal process requires ultimately, again, a larger, or at least a similar body of number and wisdom as ultimately, again, the rabbinic body that originally legislated. But I'll just tell you, by the way, where this comes up. There's a big discussion contemporarily by Kitnius, right? There's a whole movement to stop being Nizar and Kitnius, which, again, there's definitely logic to it, but remember, you could point to many Dinei Dirabanan, whose reasons no longer apply. But there's a legal system, right? And like any legal system, ultimately there's a mechanism for the overturning of earlier legislation. And just because reasons fall away does not automatically allow for legislation to fall away. There is a repeal process. So you see over here, Kerem Revai was legislated, it's covered for the Beis HaMikdash, that the marketplaces should be teeming with produce when the people are Ola Regel, or people come to the Beis HaMikdash in general. But now again, Beis HaMikdash is destroyed. You would have thought that Takana just falls off. A Haraya, it doesn't. It only is repealed when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his Beis Din get up and repeal it. So we'll say that's right number one. Listen to this. Now, when the Gemara wanted to show that a davar shebeminyan tzarich minyan achar lahatiro, that any piece of rabbinic legislation requires another rabbinic body to repeal it. And by the way, it's not just any other rabbinic body; it's a rabbinic body of similar number and wisdom. The Gemara also brought other proofs from psukim, from Maimad Har Sinai. So what are those proofs? Here we go. The pasuk says, in preparation for Matan Torah, prepare yourself for 3 days. Do not go near to a woman. So we'll say, so that's a reference to the fact that in preparation for Matan Torah, so couples had to abstain from physical intimacy. This was a din on both men and women. Torah gives a very clear timeline. 3 days. 3 days. Then Abba said, what does this say? After Kabbalah HaTorah, Kadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, Lech emor lehem shuva lechem la'alechem. Kadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, tell the people, go back to your tents. And Abba said, what does go back to your tents means? That's a euphemism for go back and resume normal marital intimate life. Now, what's the Avishayla? Why do you need that? Right? Remember again, from the beginning, how long was what we'll call the legislation? How long was it for? 3 days. So again, you talk about 3 days. After 3 days, it's over. Yet HaKadosh Baruch Hu felt compelled to say, tell Moshe, tell the people, go back to your tents. In other words, the original legislation is over. Lamali, Shmamina, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu was creating a model for us. What was the model? Called Davar Sheva Minyan, Tzarech Minyan Achar Lahatira. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was teaching us a legal precept, or a legal concept, that any piece of legislation that is legislated by, in this case it was by a divine body, but again it's just to teach us a model, ultimately requires a similar body in order to go ahead and repeal it. Maybe not. Maybe you'll say, no, maybe HaKadosh Baruch Hu was telling the couples, go back to the tents, because dafka now there was a mitzvah of ona. There was a particular mitzvah of intimacy. In other words, it wasn't just the pshat that it became permitted. Maybe HaKadosh Baruch Hu was telling them in the aftermath of Kabbalah Torah, it's now a mitzvah for a husband and wife to be intimate with each other. Tashma, b'msho chayov el hemi yalu bahar. Therefore, the pasuk said, when the shofar blows, they can go back up on Har Sinai. Remember, when during Kabbalah Torah there was a prohibition for anyone and anything to ascend the mountain. The pasuk says, when you hear the shofar blow, you can go back up the mountain. So why don't you watch this? Michtek siv kamatzon va'bakar al yira al mulaharahu. The pasuk says that the sheep and the cattle shall not graze el mul hahar hahu, by this mountain. Now Rashi points out, Rabbi said, the diak is hahar hahu. As long as the mountain is hahu, that mountain. Now when is it defined as that mountain? When the Sinaitic revelation is taking place upon that mountain, it's called hahu. So when does the grazing prohibition or the ascension prohibition devolve upon that mountain? Only when what? When it's hahu. As the moment that it's no longer hahu is the moment that all of those prohibitions concerning the mountain no longer apply. Well, if that's the case, b'msho chayov alamali. Why do I need the pasuk to say b'msho chayov al hema yalu bahar? In other words, why do I need the pasuk to say once the shofar blows you can come back on the mountain? I already know that. You already taught it to me. As long as the har is hahu, which means as long as there is divine activity, Sinaitic activity, Torah activity taking place on the mountain, you can't go on it. The moment that's over, ascension, use of the mountain becomes permitted. If that's the case, the pasuk of b'msho chayovel hema ya'alu bahar is extraneous. To which the Gemara says, Lamali, Shmamina, Davar Sheba Minyan Sarach Minyan Achalatiro. It's not extra, because what does it teach me? It teaches me, Abba said, that anything that is legislated by a particular body requires a body of the same size in order to repeal. So Kadosh Baruch Hu is teaching us a halachic construct here. That Rebbe Shalom is giving us instructions, and then he himself is repealing those same instructions. So he tells us ultimately, again, separate, right? No marital intimacy for 3 days, and then after Kabbalah Torah, go back to your tents. No one could go on the mountain, and when the shofar blows, you can go back on the mountain. It's creating a paradigm. And the paradigm is that in order to repeal a piece of legislation, you need a body of similar size and wisdom to repeal, or the same size and wisdom as the one who made the original legislation. Now, obviously, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was illustrating this with himself. The Gemara understands to apply this to the realm of rabbinic law as well. So the rabbis legislate a particular halacha, even though they might be explicit in the reasoning for it, and even though the reasoning may no longer apply, in order to get the halacha off the books, you require a rabbinic body of similar number and wisdom in order to repeal the legislation. Well, maybe you're saying, well, 1 second, Kadosh Baruch Hu is illustrating this construct in the realm of a da'araisa. So maybe in a da'araisa, you could only repeal it if you have a body of the same number and size. In that case, it would be Kadosh Baruch Hu. But by dirabanans, let's say maybe by dirabanans, as soon as what? If the rabbis legislate something for a particular reason, and the reason is no longer valid, maybe what? the takana just falls off, and you don't need to go through any official repeal process. Tashma, that's why I both say the Beitzah brought the case of Kerem Revai. Tashma, Kerem Revai. Right? That's why I both say we brought up, right? Chazal legislated that what? If you live within 1 day journey of Yerushalayim, you have to bring up your Kerem Revai. You have to bring up the produce of your vineyard. And ultimately says the Gemara, I baha Kerem Revai dirabanon. I but Kerem Revai is dirabanon. And yet, v'ka'amrlei kavar nimnu alecha chavirecha v'tiruha. And ultimately, again, they said to Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer, halacha l'maisa, you don't have to bring it up. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, your friends already got together. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his Beis Din got together, and they repealed the Gezerah. So we'll say, so therefore again, halacha l'maisa, we begin to see that what? That in Dirabanans, we now have the official construct, that in Dirabanans, when Chazal make a particular Gezerah, or takana, again, we use those words of takana and gezeres interchangeably, even though they're actually not the same things. But again, beyond the scope of our shir right now, we actually spent the Shavuos night on this a couple of years ago, talking about this, because there are situations where Chazal make rules based on certain circumstances, and when the circumstances change, the rules fall off. So it's interesting to note, and again, that's a chilik between dinei d'Rabbanan, takanos, gezeros, again, but beyond our scope for now. But not even for our purposes, what we begin to see is that halacha l'maisa, when Chazal legislate a law, that even if it's clearly driven by a particular reason, even if the reason changes, the law remains the same and on the books until a rabbinic body of similar size and wisdom comes and repeals it. Okay, so the chitema Beitzah nami imnu aleha. So maybe you'll say that halacha l'maisa, they also repealed the halachos of Beitzah. They will say all roads lead back to our Beitzah, right? So remember, right? All roads lead back to the egg. So now maybe you'll say this. Remember, going back for just a moment. What did we say before? We said before that halacha l'maisa, that Beitzah, right, by Rosh Hashana is nolda bazu asura bazu. Now remember, that was linked to the Yom HaArichta identity of Rosh Hashanah. Perhaps when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai came along and repealed essentially the Yom HaArichta legislation and pretty much said that we are Mekabel Eidos the entire day, maybe Beitzah also becomes mutter on the second day. To which the Gemara says, Beitzah nami imnu ala Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai v'sharyuha. To which the Gemara says, no, ki imnu a-eidos a-Beitzah lo imnu. No, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai wasn't worried about eggs. Right? What was he worried about? He was legislating regarding eidos. Amalei abaye atu Beitzah b'minyan mihabi. To which the Gemara says, Beitzah be'eidos talya milsa. It's not true. The truth is, the Beitzah, right, the status of the egg is intertwined with what you do about eidos. It's sar eidos, it's sar Beitzah. Once, when you, in the period of time where they asked accepting eidos, when? After mincha, the Beitzah also became aser. Ishtari eidos, ishtari Beitzah. Ultimately, again, when eidos becomes mutter, the Beitzah becomes mutter as well. So both say, so what the Gemara is saying is right. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did not pass any specific legislation regarding the egg. That he didn't do. But Lamaisa, the status of the egg is fundamentally intertwined with eidos, right? Remember, eidos drives everything. If you're accepting eidos the entire day, that means pretty much you're not going with Yom HaArichta framework. If you're only accepting eidos up until min, and therefore again, egg might be permitted second day. If you're only accepting eidos up until the time of mincha, tamish shalbein arbayim, then ultimately you are accepting Yom HaRichta framework. If you're accepting Yom HaRichta framework, it's possible that what? An egg that was laid on one day will still be also the second day. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is not making independent legislation regarding the Beitzah, but Lamaisa, whatever you're doing regarding eidos and Rosh Hashanah will drive a lot of other halachic legislation as well, specifically for our purposes, the halachos concerning the Be'ah. Rav Ada v'Rav Salman Tarvayu mibei Kluchis Amri. Rav Ada and Rav Salman both of them from Beit Kluchis, they both said as follows. We'll say, here we go. Af mitakanas Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai ve'elech Beitzah asura. Even if Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was allowing you to go ahead and what? Accept eidos. After mincha time, the Beitzah is still aser. It's still aser. Why? My timer. Listen to how beautiful this is. My timer. Mehira yibana beis hamikdash. Because in Meretz Hashem, Mehira yibana hamikdash. Halavai. The beis hamikdash will be rebuilt speedily in our days. V'yomru ishtakid milo achanu Beitzah b'yom tov sheni hashtanami nechol. So we'll say, because what's going to happen? Beis HaMikdash is going to be rebuilt in Yahrzeit Hashem speedily in our days. And what's going to happen? My chicken's going to lay an egg on the first day, right? On day 30. And I'm going to eat it on day 31, on the second day. And I'm going to say to myself, of course I can do that. Why? Because last year, I ate the egg on the second day. So to this year, I should eat the egg on the second day. Eat the egg on the second day. And I'm not going to realize that what v'lo yadi, the shtakit shtei kedushos. Last year, the 2 days were 2 kedushos. But why are the 2 days 2 kedushos? Because before the Beis HaMikdash, the legislation of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai applies, which means we accept eidos the entire day. So it's not a Yom HaArichta. It's not a Yom HaArichta, but rather it's more like a Sveika de Yoma type of situation. And therefore the days are 2 different kedushos. The Hashta, when the Beis HaMikdash is rebuilt, and we will once again go back to the legislation that what? We only accept eidos until when? Until when? Until Tamisha Ben Arbayim. Even if the 2 days are observed, they're observed as a Yom HaArichta. Well, if it's a Yom HaArichta, then what? If the chicken lays the egg on the first day, it's still usher on the second day. The Hashta Kedusha Achasi. Shaul says this is fascinating. So the Gemara says over here, this is Rav Ada and Rav Salman both say even now the egg will be usher both days. Why? In order not to create confusion between this year when there is no Beis HaMikdash and next year where there is a Beis HaMikdash. Because when there is a Beis HaMikdash, everyone agrees that ultimately it's Yom HaArichta. And if it's Yom HaArichta, then what? Then Allah Chalamayse, the egg is usher both days. It's true in the absence of the Beis HaMikdash, it may not be a Yom HaArichta. It may be Shtei Kedushos. And therefore, technically, if the chicken lays an egg on the first day, it'll be usher on the first day, but mutter on the second day. But therefore, in order to avoid any confusion, the egg is always usher both days. The Gemara says, well, 1 second. Ihachi edus nami lo nekabel. But if that's the case, should we also not be makabel edus after the time of mincha? After all, my taima, mehera yibana beis hamikdash, emer Hashem the beis hamikdash will be rebuilt speedily in our days. V'yomer, people will say, ishtakid milo kabalnu eidos hachodesh kol yom kulo. Did we not go ahead last year? We accepted eidos the entire day. Hashtanami nekabel. Ultimately, this year also with the beis hamikdash we should be mekabel eidos the entire day, and they won't realize last year we accepted eidos the entire day. Why? Because there was no carbon tamid shal bein arbayim, therefore no fear of confusion. But this year we can't because halacha l'maaseh there's a tamid we may mix up the shira. To which they want to say, here's the difference: hasam eidos mesur lebezdin, beitzah mesur lekol. But say here's the difference: eidos is not handled by every single individual. So eidos is handled by the bezdin. We trust the bezdin not to confuse this year with last year. Right? The bezdin knows what they're doing. So they know the distinction between a year in which there is a Beis HaMikdash and a year in which there is no Beis HaMikdash. They know that distinction. But ultimately, again, Beitzah, the status of the egg, that's the purview of every individual. You can't rely on individual peoples to necessarily know how to distinguish between 1 year and the next. Incredible. We'll say, listen to how the sugya ends. Rava comes along and he says, Rava Amar, Af mitakanas Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai ve'elech, Beitzah Surah. Right? Rava says that at the end of the day, even from the Takam Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and on, Beitzah is still going to be Asra on the second day. Why is that? Listen to this. Mi lamod Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Shimbo Eda min ha-mincha l'mayla. Shinoag in Osayam Kodesh u'lamachar Kodesh. They're both saying that this is fascinating. So Rava wants to suggest that even Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai would agree that if the Eidim come after mincha time, will observe both days in a state of Kedusha. But say, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, last Rashi on the daf, Mila Moda, Afagab, the Tikin, the Kabal, Eidos HaChodesh, Kolayom, Liosmonin, Lamodos, Minarishon, even though Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai essentially said that what? We will go ahead and accept Eidos the entire year. So let's remember again, the Tikkun of Yochanan ben Zakkai was, in the absence of a Beis HaMikdash, there's no reason not to accept Eidos the entire day. Why not? The only reason you wouldn't accept Eidos the entire day is why? Review, why not? Cool. Not to confuse the shira of the Tamid Shal Bein Ha'arbayim. Therefore, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, if in the absence of the Beis HaMikdash, there's absolutely no reason not to accept Eidos the entire day. But watch this. He says, nevertheless, va'afilu, right, taking the Kabbalah, Eidos chosh kol yom liyos monim lamodos min harishon, va'afilu bo la'achar mincha, listen to this, ava milasos yom tov sheni lo nekra takana rishona mimkoma. This is incredible. Rava says, you guys are confused. That's a generally true statement, right? Most of us are confused, right? So Rava says like this, you're not understanding something. The only thing Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai changed was the ability to accept Eidos the entire day. And what does that do? What does that do? That allows you calendrically to establish day 30 as Aleph Tishrei and to count everything from there. What didn't Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai touch? What didn't he touch? The 2-day concept of Yom HaArichta. Right? So we'll say this is fascinating because remember I said what's so confusing about this whole thing is originally they had the possibility of 1 day, right? Then they switched to 2 days in Eretz Yisrael, but it was Yom HaArichta. Then in Eretz Yisrael, Chutz La'aretz, they always observed 2 days, but it sounds like it was Sveika D'Yoma. Rava comes along and says, only thing Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai touched, the only thing he changed was the ability to accept Eidos the entire day. But he did not mess with the concept of 2-day Yom HaArichta. Because if you think about it, I would say logically, it doesn't make sense to touch that. Why not? Why not? Because remember, you know that the witnesses could come on one of those 2 days. Right? And therefore, again, to start with 1 day, 2 days, Sveika D'Yoma, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai left the Yom HaArichta legislation in place. That never changed. The only thing he changed was the ability to go ahead and accept Eidos min ha-mincha olamai. Look at that Rashi again. Va'afilu ba'idin lachar mincha va'milasos yom tov sheni lo ne'ekra takana rishona mimkoma. So we'll say what comes out at the end of the sugya is something amazing. Rosh Hashana is a Yom HaArichta. And from the beginning of Rosh Hashana, well now again, was it always like that? Was it always like that? Was it? No. No. It seems to be clear that originally, again, Rosh Hashanah is a 1-day Yom Tov, right? And therefore, again, in the Beis HaMikdash, they always started night number 30, assuming that you have to observe it as Yom Tov, because you assume that the witnesses are going to come, right? Therefore, they had to abstain from Malach already the night of number 30. But Rosh Hashanah wasn't always a 2-day Yom Tov. Then what ended up happening is, because of this whole issue of the Eidim coming late, mixed up with the Shira, they legislated you could only accept Eidos up until Mincha time. Now what that does do is like this. That creates a 2-day Rosh Hashanah. But not a 2-day out of doubt, a Yom HaArichta. Because there is no doubt in the Beis HaMikdash as to which was the day of Rosh Hashanah. You knew on the first day that it was either day 30 or day number 31. But you have to observe the 2 days because again, you never knew when the witnesses were going to show up. That's the institution of Yom HaArichta of Rosh Hashanah. Beis HaMikdash is destroyed. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says we could accept Eidos the whole day because there's no fear, ultimately again, of the witnesses showing up after the Talmud Shal Bein Arbaim. But what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did not touch, according to Rabbi, the Maskana of the Gemara is the Yom HaArichta. And I was about to say, the Hadlum in the Gemara was that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai maybe took away this Yom HaArichta concept also. Kamashma, no. And I was say, it's so logical. You can't mess with Yom HaArichta. Why? Because the truth is, the one part of Rosh Hashanah that you still don't know with certainty is what? Is what? When the witnesses are showing up. You know they're going to show up sometime, you just don't know when. So the Yom HaArichta legislation remained. And that's true in Eretz Yisrael, and that's true in Chutz La'aretz. And that is why Halacha L'Maisa, again, we observe 2 days of Rosh Hashanah in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. It's not a Sveika D'Yoma, right? It's not an issue of calendrical ambiguity because there is no calendrical ambiguity in Eretz Yisrael, but rather, again, it was a din, ultimately, again, of not being sure when the witnesses were going to show up. In order to preserve the sanctity of whichever day Rosh Hashanah falls out, they had to observe it as one long period of Kedusha. Nafkamina, ultimately, again, for Yom HaArichta, I will say, so one of them is, Nolda bazu asura bazu. Halacha mes. We'll see this in Shulchan Aruch tomorrow. The halacha is, I will say, if your chicken lays an egg on the first day Rosh Hashanah, you cannot eat it on the second day of Yom Tov. Why? Because the truth is, in Rosh Hashanah, there really is no second day of Yom Tov. We'll see. You know where else this comes up? Where else does this come up? Shechianu. What do we do by Kiddush on the second night of Rosh Hashanah? So this is a big shayla, because again, on one end it's the second day Yom Tov, so generally when you have a second day Yom Tov in practice mirrors the first. Mirrors the first. So if you make a Shechianu on the first night, you should make a Shechianu on the second night. But Rosh Hashanah is not a typical 2-day Yom Tiv, right? And therefore, again, maybe I shouldn't be able to say a Shechianu. So because remember, it's Yom HaRichta. So how do we obviate that? How do we address it? Again, new fruit. Right, new fruit or new article of clothing. Same thing by the Baal Tokea, right? The Baal Tokea makes a Shechianu. Also, again, we tell Baal Tokea, wear a new article of clothing. That way, again, the Shechianu could latch onto something else. We don't do that by another Yom Tiv, right? Second day Sukkos, you don't need to go, you make a Shechianu also like second day Sukkos, you don't need to go ahead and wear a new, wear a new fruit. You should never wear a new fruit, right? But Lamaisi, you don't have to wear a new article of clothing, you have a new fruit. Why not? Because remember, by Sukkos, by Avi Yomim Tovim, the second day Yom Tov is a Sveika de Yoma. So Sveika de Yoma, again, quote unquote, we're not sure which day it is. So therefore, day number 2 obviously mirrors day number 1 in all practices. But by Rosh Hashanah, where the second day is not Sveika de Yoma, but Yom Arichta, we want to replicate the practices on day number 2, like day number 1. But when it comes to brachos, specifically Shechianu, you have to make sure that there's something else of the Shechianu to latch onto. So Shechianu, Beitzah, we'll see other examples of this that are mirrored in the Yom Arichta concept. So stop here. Shkoyach.